empathy a lot. And so I think, the whole goal of what I'm going to present now is to look beyond empathy and see what else in terms of cognitive skills is implicated in how children develop their prosocial and altruistic skills. And understanding that also kind of leads to how we can best support that as well. So I'm a neuropsychologist, and I have a part-time work as a researcher. So I work for Université Lyon 2, but I'm based in Paris, and specifically working on a social emotional learning project and platform for Santé Publique France. So that's my research job half of the week. And then the other half of the week, I recently started a private practice. And so I see children, teens, young adults for assessments, but also for therapy. It's based mostly on acceptance and commitment therapy. And so most of my private practice therapy clients tend to be kids and teens with ADHD or ASD, but also parents. And I'm also trained in diagnosing and treating parental burnout. So that's kind of in a nutshell. So let's get started. Feel free to, I guess, interrupt me if you have any questions. I also have some breakout questions here and there. And Grania, please let me know if I am talking way too much, because that is what I tend to do. All right. So often when we talk about altruism, people tend to say, what is altruism? I remember when I first was in front of a committee to get a fellowship for my PhD, this one guy who was the president of the jury, he said, I think altruism doesn't exist. What do you think? Which was a great start, but at least you got me into practicing how to defend the idea that altruism exists. So I'm just going to go into the definition very quickly. And then, there's this whole question of why look into how it develops. Why is it interesting? Why is it important to look into how altruism develops in children? And then I'll kind of go into something that was really the core of my research, which was looking into predictors of altruistic intention and behavior in children. And what I'd like to discuss with you, if you're up for it, really is the implications that has for children with neurodivergent profiles. And finally, this big question, which is, can altruism be encouraged? And so what can we take away from that? And where do we need to be careful? All right, so in terms of what altruism is, if we look at kind of the formal definition of it, and you'll see that on all of my slides, I have references on the bottom left. So if you want to go into something a little deeper, feel free to take a look at that, or send me an email afterwards and I'll be happy to send along some articles. So altruistic behavior is importantly a voluntary action that intentionally benefits another. So this idea of it being voluntary, intentional. And it's also without expectation of a personal reward or external punishment. And it's often an action that comes with a cost for the actor. And so when we talk about voluntary action that intentionally benefits another, that's also called prosocial behavior more generally. And what makes it really altruistic is this idea that you're not expecting a personal reward. You're not, fearing this external punishment. And often it comes with a cost. Let's imagine some kind of a random example. You're on your way to work, you're late for work, and you see someone that drops a bag filled with groceries. It splits open, and you're going to be late for work. But if you stop and you help them pick it up, that will be considered altruistic because there's a cost for you, and you're really not getting much of a reward out of it. So what's interesting from a developmental point of view is that we consider that prosocial behavior includes helping, sharing, comforting, cooperation as well, but you can link that to helping and sharing. They're observed very early in child development. So I love this little video of a 16-month-old child. And so what you can see was a 14-month-old, sorry, a 14-month-old child. So the experimenter here, the researcher drops something on the floor, and automatically the kids, they kind of crawl up and they grab it and they hand it back, and you think, oh, wow, kids learn to help so early on in life. They do. But from then on, it gets a little more complicated. So from the age of 14 to 18 months, kids are able to, well, toddlers really, are able to start helping, sharing, and comforting with enough cues coming from the adults. Like here, like his hand is like this, and you can tell he's trying to catch something. So they need some cueing. They don't do it. They can't interpret what the other person is really thinking and what they need quite yet. But from the age of 3 onwards, they're able to interpret, you know, much more discrete and subtle emotional cues to be able to engage in these prosocial behaviors. And so, you know, you would think, oh, wow, okay, so from then on, it's just, you know, we just help share comfort all the time. Well, what we do know is that humans can and do help each other throughout the lifespan, even in contexts of extremely high uncertainty, extremely high stress. And there's this notion that's known as the post-disaster utopia, this image of, you know, people coming together after a disaster. You know, I'm from the Midwest, so obviously I had to include a picture of a tornado. So people, you know, coming together to clean a house after a tornado. And there's been some great research on, for example, this idea of coming together and acting prosocially after floods, even in kids, teenagers, after floods, terrorist attacks. So there's a lot of research on this. And so we do see that there are factors that support the fact that individuals will come together, they will help, they will share information, they will comfort each other. So even in these contexts where their life is at stake. And interestingly, so COVID gave us, you know, this huge amount of research to kind of sift through. And there was quite a bit of research on prosocial behavior during COVID. And what researchers found was that we are able to adapt to the context quite flexibly and modulate what it means to be prosocial in this context. And so I just wanted to take the example of COVID-19. So if you take this distinction of, you know, helping, sharing, comforting as being examples of prosocial behavior, in general, helping is considered, you know, instrumental. It's answering an instrumental need, bringing something that will help somebody do something else. Sharing is usually material. You know, you share an object, you share a certain amount of something that you have with someone else. And comforting is often expressed by touch and by facial expressions. And during COVID, all of that changed, you know, with mask wearing, with social distancing. Helping was also financial. You know, there were a lot of donations during that time. Sharing became, you know, not necessarily material sharing because you couldn't touch the same things, but also sharing information. You know, there's research on how people just kind of all flock towards WhatsApp groups to share humorous memes, you know, to just create a sense of belonging and community. And finally, comforting that it couldn't be expressed through touch and through facial expressions due to mask wearing, which tended to be more verbal. And so what's interesting here is that researchers found that children from age 6 on were able to very flexibly adapt their prosocial behavior depending on if they were in a phase where social distancing was more strongly enforced versus in a phase where it wasn't. And so they're very easily able to shift from one to the other. And so I find that really interesting in terms of what humans are able to do with their prosocial behavior. You know, altruistic behavior, this is nothing new for anyone, but we know that it helps sustain cooperation in a society. There are positive consequences on well-being throughout the lifespan, sense of purpose, feeling of belonging. I mean, so just positive consequences all around, huge benefits. But yet, and this is really a big yet, research has showed us that there's a general decrease, and this has been like in the past more than a decade, in interest in others, and also a general decrease in civic engagement. And parallel to that is you know, I think we all see it, there's a huge social polarization, and this polarization has a negative impact on out-group altruism. So altruism towards people who are not in our social group. So we know that altruism is important, right? It has a lot of benefits, but we also see that it's extremely fragile. So I think the big driver in my research was saying, you know, if we want to encourage it in younger generations, we need to understand its development. You know, we need to know what the factors are that come into play in altruism development in children. So this leads me to the main topic of this talk, which is the cognitive predictors of altruistic intention and behavior in childhood. So you'll see why I kind of distinguish intention and behavior. I'm going to talk about that. Both are important, but it's mostly due to the way we test them and to be a little more clear in the way we test things from a research point of view. So here's what we know. We know that prosocial and altruistic behavior, they increase throughout childhood up to around age 10. Afterwards, adolescence. I'm not going to get into adolescence because prosocial behavior just, kind of goes on a roller coaster. And what's interesting here is from around age 5 to age 10, there's a lot that happens. So if you ask 5-year-olds, you give them, let's say you give them a set of, I don't know, like 10 stickers that they really like. And you say, well, there's a kid here that didn't get stickers. What do you think you should do? You can give some to the other kid. What do you think you should do? And they'll say, oh, I think I should share. I think I should share. And then you bring them in the lab and you kind of set up the whole situation and you say, so here's another kid that didn't get any stickers. If you want, you can share some stickers with this child. I'm going to exit the room and I'm going to let you put them in an envelope. And they don't share, right? And they say, well, I wanted to keep them for myself. So it's what we call this knowledge behavior gap at around age 5, which is really interesting. So they understand the norm, they understand what they're supposed to do in terms of kind of a fairness norm, but they're unable to do it. And then around, 8, 9, 10 years old, they learn how to act on that fairness norm. So they've integrated it, but they also act on it. And so they're able to kind of think and have these considerations of fairness, act on them, whether it's with friends, preferentially with friends, but also with non-friends. And so this is really also due to increases in social reasoning that we see. Kids at this age are learning how to reason based on group belonging. And they're also learning how to reason and understand their own biases. And that's really interesting. We tend to think that kids starting at a certain age have this, very strong group dynamic, right? But they're also able to reason and say, I know that this is a bias that I have cognitively. And so this is what I need to do to overcome it and to counter it in my actions. Again, this is like in a lab. This is not in a situation where they're at school with, all of their friends around them, because that has a huge impact as well. What I think is really interesting is that altruistic behavior increases, but it also becomes so much more complex. If you see 2 young children together, like 2 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, they'll play next to each other. They'll be playing with their cars. They won't necessarily be playing together. They may talk a little bit. They may exchange things here and there. But then, you look at 10-year-olds having a conversation, and it's so much more involved. And so that really is due to considerations of friendships. What is a friendship? A friendship is based on mutual trust. It's based on this idea that if I help you out today, I'm not expecting you to help me out 5 minutes later. I know that one day you may help me out. One day you may also do something for me. So it's kind of this long-term projection. It's being able to project your friendship into the long term. But what's also really strong, and keep this in mind, I'm going to come back to it later, is this idea of reputational concerns. This is the age where, I don't know, if you have kids who are around, 8, 9, 10, or who are now older, or if you're around these kids and they speak French, you've probably heard like la honte, right? And my daughter just turned 8. I hear it all the time. It's like, c'est la honte, c'est la honte. These reputational concerns, they become so strong. And so considerations of how much I'm going to share, do I apply this fairness norm in this context, also come with who's watching me. I mean, there are these great studies on the fact that even with adults, if you stick a pair of eyes on a wall, like a drawing of eyes, people will act more prosocially. And so, I don't know what that entails in terms of home decor, but there are these studies, that tend to show if we're watched, we don't act the same way. And children learn this extremely fast. This develops, really by age 8, 9, this is already pretty robust. And so the question here is also, what drives all of this? What drives this more complex altruistic behavior? There's this idea of friendships, reputational concerns, but cognitively, what is this all linked to? And so historically in child development research, what we see is that there's this idea of prosocial and altruistic behavior being driven by empathy on the one hand, and moral norms on the other. And sometimes, you read about moral emotions somewhere in the middle, that's kind of a mix. But, historically, if you look in the 1980s, 1990s, 2000s, studies on prosocial behavior in kids was really all about this. And it goes back to the 18th century. I mean, you see this like debate between Kant and his contemporaries, then you had Schopenhauer, and they all had this debate on what drives altruism. Is it empathy? Is it feeling with another? Or is it this kind of civic duty that's driven by moral norms? And so for a very long time, investigating other cognitive skills just wasn't in the picture. However, there are some great models out there. I'm not gonna get into the detail with this one, but I think it's if you want to look into it, it's really interesting. Crick and Dodge in the 1990s, they came up, so they researched antisocial behavior in children. And they came up with a model that they called the social information processing model, that essentially models all the cognitive abilities that come into play, and cognitive operations, if you will, that come into play when a child is in a situation and they have to decide how to act on it. And so, if you kind of look into it, you start with a database of moral norms, yes, but also memory. And then, you have to encode the cues around you. What's going on around you? So visual attention, you have to be able to interpret them. Then you have to clarify your own goals, related to that. Create a response, construct a response, pick the response you want to enact the response. And then based on that, be able to understand how people are reacting to it. And then it starts all over again. So, you can clearly see here that it's a lot more than just empathy and moral norms. And this is easy to find online if you're interested in digging a little deeper. But I think the authors, so it was really developed for understanding antisocial behavior in children, but they also recommended that it be applied to kind of the extreme opposite, which is altruistic behavior in children as well. So in research, what we see is that, sorry, I hear my son crying about something. He's okay. So what we know is that there are a number of cognitive predictors of prosocial and altruistic behavior that have been highlighted in research. So in the 4 to 6 year olds, cognitive and emotional regulation and theory of mind, otherwise known as perspective taking. In older children, 6 to 7, visual analysis plays a role, attention, cognitive and emotional regulation, again, theory of mind. And then in the 7+ kind of this like older elementary school age group, there were studies on cognitive and emotional regulation as playing a role in prosocial and altruistic behavior, but there wasn't much else. And so we set out with the team I was part of to understand, what else was at play besides cognitive and emotional regulation. So this is the nerdy part, so I'm not gonna go really deep into it because I think that's not the most interesting part of this discussion. But so we launched a project with 67 participants. It's not that much, but it was a very, very heavy and long-term project. They went through 2 huge assessments, and so they had a big cognitive assessment. These kids came in, so they were in 3rd, 4th, and 5th US grade, so CE2, CM1, CM2. And they came in, they had an assessment of visual analysis, attention, inhibition skills, so your behavioral regulation, a parent rating, also of inhibition, a theory of mind task, the faux pas, which you might know, and then a parent rating of empathy, the Griffith empathy measure. So they came in, they had all that. And then, and this is where it got kind of fun, we assessed their altruism level. And so to do that, we assessed their altruistic intention. And so that was done with a translation of the altruism scale for children. So there's an American version, and we translated and validated it into French. And so it's a 20-item scale that measures, so it's kind of like scenarios. So I don't know if you see these quizzes sometimes that you have in magazines during the summer, where you have to, it's scenarios, you answer A, B, or C, and then at the end they say, oh, you have a majority of A's or B's or C's. To kids, I described it as those quizzes that tell you what kind of Harry Potter character you are. And so they were all like, oh yeah, okay. And so the version of this questionnaire, it's scenarios, so how would you act in this situation, measures altruism in familiar contexts and altruism in more distant or unfamiliar contexts. So it was validated. So if you're interested in using it clinically, it's available. Just let me know. It's also open access, so you can find it online. And so we use that to measure altruistic intention, so to speak, because they're not really acting out these scenarios. So it's not quite behavior. And then we measured altruistic behavior with a game theory task that has just a name that's absolutely, it's terrible for children, the dictator game. But the kids didn't get the name, but I just, it makes me smile every time. The basic principle of the dictator game, which is often used in research with children as well as with adults, is that they come in and you say, hey, thanks for coming in. You can pick 10 of these great emoji erasers from a big bowl to thank you for coming in. And so they pick them out, they get very invested in it, And then at one point I say, okay, so, we give out these little gifts, but there's a child on the 6th floor of the lab who's taking part in another research project, and they're not getting anything. So if you want, you can share some with them, but you don't have to. But they do know that this is where we see the kids that get the erasers. So they left a little note under the door before I arrived. And so we have a little note written by a child that says, serais-tu d'accord pour partager tes cadeaux avec moi? Or do you agree to share your gifts with me? And then step out of the room and they decide how many they want to share. And so, interestingly, it goes from 0 to 10 out of 10. There's a wide range of how much children share. I tested this with my daughter when she was, I think she was 7 or 6.5, hoping that, she would share 5 out of 10, and she shared 1. So it goes to show that you can research altruism, but it doesn't make your kids more altruistic. So anyway, I always like to tell that story. She finds it very funny. She still has her erasers though. And so that was how we measured altruism. That's, typically how it's measured. It's an imperfect measure, but it's really kind of all we have unless we're going into a classroom and really observing what's happening, which is a whole other method, which is great, but requires another type of involvement. And so here, just to give you an idea regarding this wide array of giving in the dictator game. So the red dots are the kids who are in the youngest grade in CE2. The green dots are the children in the middle grade CM1, and the blue dots are the CM2. And so what you can see is that the donation doesn't necessarily get higher. What it does is that the plot gets a little tighter, meaning that children tend to give more of the same amount, sort of like they all come down to this baseline level of giving with age. So, why is that? So here's what we found, and I think, I'd be interested in hearing what you think about this, is that depending on grade level, so we categorized them by, they were split by grade level and not by age. So CE2, CM1, CM2. We found that certain skills tend to support and kind of boost altruistic intention and behavior, and others tend to nuance it. So it's not decrease it, it's to nuance it towards this, kind of baseline level that I showed you. And specifically in 3rd graders, we found that visual analysis, attention, and behavioral and emotional regulation supported altruistic intention or behavior. And then when you flip over to the 4th and 5th graders, these same cognitive abilities, visual analysis, attention, and behavioral and emotional regulation actually nuance altruistic intention and behavior, bring it down towards this baseline level. And in 3rd graders, so the youngest kids, theory of mind skills also nuanced this altruistic behavior. And interestingly, so I'm going to go over this, but interestingly, empathy was nowhere to be found. So empathy really had no effect whatsoever on the way we measured altruism. And so why do you have, on one end, in the youngest kids, cognitive abilities that boost altruism, and in the older kids, these same cognitive abilities that kind of dampen it or, nuance it? Our hypothesis here was that it's most likely due to gains in social reasoning and strategy, meaning that when kids are young, when they're able to pay better attention, they're able to regulate the fact that, they may want to keep it all for themselves, but they're going to activate this fairness norm. So all of these skills are going to help them increase their altruistic intention or behavior because they're not reasoning quite as strategically yet from a social point of view. And then in the 4th and 5th graders, and qualitatively, I could see this when they came into the lab, the older kids would say, but does the child know that I have these erasers and that I may decide not to give them? So, it's another level of understanding and of social reasoning. Once again, this consideration of reputation. If you don't give any erasers away, you seem like a really unkind person. However, if you give all of your erasers away, it doesn't make you look smart, right? It makes you look like you really didn't think it through. And so the idea of how important this social reasoning and strategy is. And of course, as kids become stronger in attention, behavioral and emotional regulation, they're able to reason more strategically from a social point of view as well. And so for us, that was really what explained this huge difference in terms of these same skills boosting and then nuancing altruistic intention and behavior. And so, Grunin, let me know if we have, kind of just a moment. I was thinking here might be a nice time to discuss together and kind of know what your take is on
perfect.
The implications for children with, neurovisual, attentional, or behavioral and emotional regulation difficulties. I found this picture here of a French cours de récré. We forget what it's like to be in a cours de récré for not working in a school, right? There's a great French documentary, I don't know if you've ever seen it, called Récréation by, I think it's Claire Simon, from the 90s. But it kind of throws you into this jungle that is recess with kids, right? And there's so much going on. And, research has shown us that children with ADHD, for example, and generally children with attentional difficulties, they aren't as prosocial. Why is that? I mean, just, imagine everything that's going on at recess. To be able to help somebody that fell at recess, you have to be able to notice that the person fell at recess. If there's a lot going on, if there's a lot of noise, a lot of movements, it can be tough to notice that somebody actually needs help, and that's just one example among many that kind of shows us that for these children with who are, differently abled in the sense of attention, regulation, or, really neurovisual functioning, prosocial behavior can be a lot tougher, and so I was wondering, kind of what often parents will tell me, my son or daughter, they never help out. I can tell, like, they're in the street, they don't even notice that somebody needs help, or, they're not going to move to the side of the sidewalk to let somebody pass, and I tell them, you don't even notice when people need help. And you want to say, well, no, they're probably not noticing. And it's not that they're not noticing that somebody needs help. They're just not necessarily, noticing what's going on at this present moment. So I was wondering, what some stereotypes you may have witnessed or experienced might be when it comes to prosocial behaviors and neurodivergent children. It can be in your professional, line of work or personally.
Lucie, would you like us to go into breakout groups, or do you want to discuss it as a large group?
I don't know. What do you think? I mean, I feel like a large group.
A large group should work.
Okay, we can give it a try.
Yeah. Guys, what do you think? Any stereotypes for prosocial behaviors with neurodivergent kids? It's like, my own thoughts would be, sometimes if you've got ADHD or something like that, you've got so much information coming at you and you can't filter it.
Right.
And it's the same even for kids with autism, etc. They've got an awful lot of information coming towards them and they can't filter. And so it's hard for them to, I think, tune into altruistic behaviors or some of the actual cognitive things that would lend themselves towards thinking about their reputation and stuff like that before reacting, maybe.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Has anybody else experienced similar things or observed kind of similar?
I guess I can share. Excuse me. Well, certainly, this is something I hear all the time from parents about the teachers complaining about the kids not helping, not participating, getting into trouble, for things that they didn't mean to do. The intention was never there. They never noticed. They could not control. There's some impulse control problems with the emotional regulation. So this is very common what I hear from parents, from school teachers, so on, when you have kids who are on neurodivergent in any way. And sometimes, yeah, you put neurovisual in there, and that's something that people don't realize. Sometimes it's like a visual problem where they just don't quite see the things as clearly. And it's not necessarily their vision's fine, it's just they don't quite pick up on things. And so, yeah, there's that. Certainly what you're saying. I mean, I hear it all the time with the kids that we see.
And also the example of sharing, in kids who have lower impulse control, and parents will say, but they never share, they never want to share. Well, right, it makes sense, and for them being forced to share, sometimes parents will force them to share, can be really, really tough on them, because they see other kids who are sharing spontaneously, right? And some parents can, if you're at the park, they'll feel embarrassed that their child's not sharing, which is sad, but it happens in these social settings. And so, yeah, definitely, I think, and so it's important to keep in mind that it's not just empathy, right? It's not just empathy, it's attention, it's impulse control, and it's visual analysis of the context and the scene around you. And so I was wondering, as as practitioners, as parents, as educators, what your thoughts are on how we can go beyond this common, saying that we often say to children, which is put yourself in someone else's shoes, to encourage and support prosocial behavior. Because so what we found is that theory of mind, so perspective taking, essentially putting yourself in someone's shoes, can not necessarily backfire, but it increases your ability to reason about the situation, right? When you're able to take someone else's perspective, understand their intentions, understand what they must be thinking in this moment, then you can reason more strategically, because you have a better grasp on the situation. And in terms of altruism, that doesn't necessarily mean acting more altruistically. I mean, there's a great study that found that in kids ages, I think they were 8 to 10, I believe, what they did is that they placed children faced with an adult that needed help. And they found that children modulated whether or not they helped and how they helped based on what they thought the adult knew about their own ability to help. I mean, so just, imagine that, like, the level of theory of mind here. And so this is really advanced theory of mind. And so they'll modulate that response. And so put yourself in someone else's shoes works to a certain extent. But clearly it's not enough. And so I was, wondering if you had any insights really from a practical perspective on how to go beyond that with children to encourage prosocial behavior.
It's interesting because there was a study done in hospitals on trying to encourage them to wash hands between patients. And you might think, okay, they're all washing their hands, it's, hygienic environment, but they weren't. But to encourage them, what they did was they had a couple of different control groups, and one was they got them to jot down when they did it. But then another group, they had somebody else record when they washed their hands. When somebody else was recording, there was more hand washing going on than when they were self-recording. So reputation and being viewed by others increases the likelihood that they might do something like that. So instead of maybe putting yourself in someone else's shoes, maybe it's something like, I can see you. Or you know, your friends can see you. Your friends are noticing, perhaps, maybe. Your friends notice. I don't know. Like somebody else could come up with a line that's more child friendly, but just I'm trying to pull it out from
the idea that it's not going to be noticed.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Alicia has her hand up.
Thanks. Thank you, Lucy. This is great. I don't know if my comment will be as pertinent, but I definitely work on theory of mind with my clients quite often and look at it when I'm doing my evaluations, of course. But I use a lot of social stories and teach parents about using social stories very often in my recommendations section of my evaluations. And then I'll show them or get examples and show them how they can create their own social stories at home. It doesn't have to be that the therapist does them, that we can make them ourselves as parents. But I find that it just gets on the child's level. I mean, it depends on, it can be anything, right? A social story can be something about a behavior we're trying to wean away from, like touching your face, right? That has nothing to do with what you're talking about. But there are lots of social stories on, can you empathize with others, or have you ever had that situation happen to you? So you'll get through a little scenario, you'll go through the dialogue, and then you bring it at the end to say, has that ever happened to you? And then we're working on communication, of course, to say, so what are the sentences, or what are the things that you would say to the other person, or what have you said, and that's the way we try to bring awareness and then practice that dialogue. So carry it over at home and then recreate it with siblings or parents.
That's great. Yeah, taking it a step further, and really practicing it. I think practicing it with other siblings and practicing it with other family members also forces, in a way, kids to adapt the scenario to the other person. And it may not look exactly the same, and I think that's great. Yeah.
But the next time, then they're ready, because you mentioned this in your talk, and it takes it all to another cognitive level of, oh, now I have to analyze this, and they will find that they will be faced with that situation again and again, or in a different manner, but they'll say, oh yeah, I can use my memory and say, yes, how did I act in that, and what did I learn, and hopefully I can then get it right the next time, or be more proactive the next time.
Yeah, it's a real toolkit.
Rachel, Els, and Amy, in that order, have their hands up, Lucy. So Rachel, would you like to start?
Yeah, can you hear me? I'm not sure if
Yes.
you can hear me. Yeah. So I remember reading some research paper which kind of links onto that a little bit, which was about video gaming. So maybe older children, is it really dangerous? And I think in the study, I can't remember what it was called, but it was that video games which had pro-social behavior in it was actually very positive for the children, because they integrated that, and actually, rather than being video game being negative because of all the violence, the games which had pro-social behaviors actually had a really positive effect. And I think that just kind of leads into these seeing examples of pro-social behavior around them. I don't know if
Yeah, I've read about that. I mean, I think I don't exactly have the question of video games yet in my household. My kids are still young, but no, it's true, and there's something to be said for those pro-social games that really increase cooperation.
Yeah, I was surprised because you always imagine it to be all negative, and I was like, oh, okay, that's an interesting point of view.
There is something good to be said about video games. Thanks, Rachel.
Els, you're up next.
Yes, I am not really going into the direction of the last question. From the beginning on, I was thinking about parentification. Children who are consciously or subconsciously put into a place where they do have to help their parent. can have an impulse to give much more than the average children. And I wonder what impact that would have on their empathy and on their capacity to give. But they are usually the forgotten children, the unnoticed children. It's like parentified kids can be bruyant, they can be causing a lot of problems, or they can be extremely sage,
Right.
too adapted. So my plea is for these forgotten children, because I think the shift can be in the other direction too, and that those children should be accompanied as well.
Absolutely. I agree with you. I mean, and I think the balance here is finding the balance between a level of prosocial behavior and assertiveness, and assertiveness in knowing what your needs are.
Yeah.
And I saw this also during testing, some kids who were older and who would just give everything, and they say, oh, but I don't need anything. I don't need anything. So I'm going to give everything. So that's exactly what you're saying. It's the other extreme. I worked in epilepsy quite a bit, and we would see this with siblings of children with epilepsy, because they really grew up afraid for their sibling and, constantly caring for somebody else. And it does transfer over sometimes, not always, but it does transfer over to their daily life. And I agree with you that it's so important for these children to learn how to develop their assertiveness with respect to their needs and desires as well. I agree.
So to be in touch with their own needs, because later on I do work with adults who do not know what their needs are.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point that you're making.
Okay, that was it.
Thank you. Were there any other
Amy had her hand up. I don't know, Amy, if your question was answered or if you still.
Yeah, I mean, it was sort of answered, but I really like Elle's point. It's really interesting because, as a therapist, I feel like we see, I don't know, overall, I see more people who haven't developed assertiveness, who maybe had to think too much about other people when they were growing up. And so, so I think it's a great point. And then, so I'm just wondering, Lucie, would you say that the other side of the coin for prosocial behavior, that's assertiveness? Because there's also this sense of like knowing that it's okay to receive comfort and to receive, I can't remember the other elements of it, but
help, caring?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, assertiveness and definitely just self-esteem,
Okay.
and knowing that you're also worthy of receiving help,
Yeah.
right? And receiving prosocial behaviors. And so, I definitely think that's a crucial point. Nobody wants their kids to grow up and just kind of give away everything they have, help all the time without thinking of themselves, comfort without ever being comforted, right? Nobody wants that for their children. And so I think this idea of assertiveness and self-esteem as being, the balance also in prosocial behavior is really key. That's not something I studied in my research, but it is something that I'm working on this social emotional learning platform for Santé Publique France. And that's not something that many French adults are well versed in, self-esteem and assertiveness. So there's a lot of work to be done, but that's definitely some great points that you've all raised. Great. Are there any other questions, or should we move on? I can move on. All right. So there's this idea of, okay, these are some cognitive predictors. Empathy is not necessarily at the forefront. Empathy has its importance, but we also need to look towards attentional emotional behavioral regulation skills, visual analysis. And so what about programs to train altruism and prosocial behavior, right? So first of all, just kind of a show of hands, has anyone here ever implemented or taken part in an educational program that's specifically designed to improve prosocial behavior, or part of kind of a greater social and emotional learning program as participants, or, you know, as somebody, as a clinician, or implemented them in schools? Okay, no one. All right. I'm not
No,
sure.
I would have to ask, does that exist in France?
Well, I did it as part of a study. I was creating or fostering a sense of belonging, and that also increased prosocial behavior in classes.
Yes.
So
Yes, absolutely. Yeah,
that was kind of trying to help kids to identify shared interests, shared experiences, shared different values and stuff like that. It was actually a really interesting study, and it also improved life satisfaction as well as prosocial behavior and sense of belonging.
Oh, great. Well, you know, and so Alicia, I kind of coming back to the question that you asked in the chat. Well, I think the United States has more of a history of implementing these programs, you know, and so we have kind of a couple years extra in terms of research and being able to look at the impact of these programs that implement social emotional learning, you know, although in some parts of the United States they're backtracking on that, but and it's true
Sorry,
that in France,
Lucie, it was just, my comment was just to you, so maybe you want to reference that comment, only because
sorry.
That's why that's why it's not clear. Sorry.
No, so you were commenting on the fact that you wondered if the research outcome would be the same in the US versus in Europe, due to, well, the presence or, you know, absence of these educational programs, or, you know, learning that is more geared towards working with others, awareness of others. And so, you know, I totally agree that historically it's not something that's been part of French education. I will say, though, that it seems to be changing a little bit. I was going to say quite a bit, but then I corrected.
I agree.
Changing a little bit. And so it'll be interesting to see how that impacts study findings. I mean, if you look at PISA scores in the OECD, you'll see that France is at the bottom of all OECD countries for cooperation. So that says a lot, you know, and I feel like there have been some improvements in how classes are structured in space, you know. I mean, historically, it's like these lines of desks. Kids aren't allowed to help each other, you know, they can't talk to each other at all. And I feel like some classes are moving towards U-shaped, you know, when they can, or kind of smaller tables. But, you know, there's still a lot of work.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point. That's right.
But yeah, no, definitely. I feel like, you know, the US was one step ahead on this. I don't know if they're going to remain one step ahead, though, for very long, unfortunately. But Europe is catching up. And so, you know, what we do know, and I think this is really comforting and encouraging, is that prosocial behavior is malleable in childhood. You can train prosocial behavior in kids, and it can be encouraged on the long term. So not only on the short term, but also on the long term. So you think, you know, okay, great. So, you know, let's all do this, right? There's a recent meta-analysis that came out, kind of the big one on social emotional learning programs was a 2011 analysis. And there's a new one that came out this summer that confirms this idea of a positive effect of social emotional learning programs on prosocial behavior and on school achievement. And so we know that generally, if you look at general effects, these social emotional learning programs have a positive effect. And so usually, if you look at how they're constructed, there, you know, many of them, they have modules that are dedicated to empathy, perspective taking, emotional regulation, kind of from a cognitive standpoint. That's what they center on. And then prosocially speaking, there's often sections on understanding prosociality. So this is kind of information, what does it mean to volunteer? What does it mean to help out? Let's, look at some examples of people who help out, volunteers, this or that. And then a section that's really dedicated to practicing it, putting it into practice. And so the question here is, how do cognitive skills play into this? And so what we found was that baseline cognitive skills. So essentially, I'm just going to go into this for 2 seconds, but the kids who came in for this initial assessment that I discussed earlier, they stayed on for 8 weeks. And so some of them didn't take part in a program, and the others took part in 2 different types of programs, but it was an online altruism training program where, so half of them only had prosocial information. So they viewed videos and like narrated slides on what it means to be altruistic, helping, videos about volunteers, like children who volunteer. And then another group had the same information, and then they were able to practice, and the quotes here are really important because it was during COVID. So practice prosocial behavior online in a sort of simulation where they picked a cause that they were interested in. And based on that, it put them in a program where twice a week they had to undertake small actions for their cause. So it could be protecting the planet, it was helping children in hospitals. And the third one, why do I not remember I created this program? Whoa. Anyway, and the third one was income inequality, I think. And so the tasks they had to do basically were, 1 week it was making a poster to teach people about their cause. Another week it was problem solving around a problem, a hypothetical problem with the team of volunteers, writing a speech to present their cause to younger children. So, we tried putting them into action as much as possible given the circumstances. So we found no effect of the program. This needs to be said. However, what was really interesting is that we found that baseline cognitive skills actually affected whether or not the program worked for some kids. And so empathy, perspective taking, and emotional regulation all played into it, all predicted it positively. But so did visual analysis and attention. So once again, confirming this idea that it's not just empathy, but that these baseline cognitive skills play a role in whether or not these other modules in the program are going to work for this child. And so, this is a lot of cognitive skills. And I think what's important here is that social emotional learning and prosocial learning programs, and this is kind of, I think, a takeaway both for this idea of training programs, but also the cognitive predictors of altruism. They cannot be one size fits all. They cannot be. You cannot take a program and just apply it to different grades. And also within a grade, it's so important to consider cognitive differences. Within one class, children will not benefit in the same way from a prosocial training program. And I think that's something that's so important to take into account. And it's so important to adopt what's called a dark logic reasoning here. The term is a little scary, but dark logic reasoning is essentially trying to consider everything that could be wrong with something before we implement it. And so social emotional learning programs, you would tend to say it like, oh, it's amazing. Everything is good about a social emotional learning program. What's not to like about a social emotional learning program, right? Well, if you take these traditional programs, when they're implemented in classes that have children who have lower cognitive skills, lower cognitive ability, so it can be attention, it can be behavioral and emotional regulation, it can be general executive functioning skills. And this is really important because research shows us that children from underserved neighborhoods tend to have lower executive functioning skills for a host of factors that I'm not going to get into, but they do. And so the risk here is that if you're implementing a traditional program, you may widen this inequality gap in terms of access to learning. And so that, I think, is something that, for me at least, was a really interesting takeaway and really important takeaway. It's that, you may think when you're designing a social emotional learning program that it's going to be great. But in fact, you may not be helping everybody out, and it may just benefit to the kids who are already at a certain level of cognitive function if you don't do it correctly. And so this really kind of is in line with the findings also in this recent meta-analysis, that you need to start with more cognitive training if you're implementing this type of program to get everybody up to speed, and then go into the more interpersonal modules. So everything is prosocial behavior, cooperation, interacting with others. And so that I found, really, really interesting. And I think it's something that we can all keep in mind in the way we implement, whether it's, remediation or programs in schools, or, the way we bring up prosociality with clients or patients as well. And last but not least,
Sorry, Lucy.
Yeah.
We did have a social emotional program in the Singapore schools. I came from Singapore, so and we actually, from the headquarters, the Ministry of Education, the education program division actually designed a social emotional program that takes care about, self-awareness, and then awareness of others, how to make responsible decision making, and this program was actually pushed out to the schools in the CCE program, which is compulsory, and it happens like once a week for a double period. So we I think it was designed in such a way that it caters to the different age group, because like what you said, depending on the cognitive level, you have to design it differently so that the students can receive it well. So yeah. But you are right to say it is not a one size fits all, because within the class, they even if it's within the same age group, they can have different cognitive levels.
Absolutely. Did we lose May? All right.
Eventually.
She's back. Well, thank you, May. Yes, that's a really great example, and I think it's really illustrates this idea very well. And so I think I just wanted to end on a clinical perspective as well, because I'm a clinician as well as a researcher, and I think this is probably also going to speak to a lot of you. Is that I think one main takeaway is that when you observe perceptual, and or cognitive difficulties in a child, I think it's important to systematically explore possible difficulties in prosocial and altruistic behavior. We look at social functioning quite a bit, but then prosocial behavior is also something else. It can show up in some scales, but it's such an important part of our life. It's such an important part of our of who we are, also of how we feel in our life, how we navigate our life, how people view us, that I think it's really worth exploring kind of in depth when we can. And it's also true the other way around. When you observe a child that has difficulties regarding prosocial and altruistic behavior, it's interesting and important to go look for possible perceptual difficulties, neurovisual difficulties, visual difficulties in visual analysis, or, attention, regulation. And so I think that's kind of the big takeaway, I would say, that I kind of want to leave you with. It's that it's important to look at prosocial behavior in children, and really keep that in mind as something that's crucial and that's worth spending time on. And so thank you to everybody that kind of made this research happen. It was a very collaborative effort, very prosocial effort. And thank you for listening in, and I'm happy to answer any other questions you might have. Is my timing okay, Grania?
It's going to be fantastic. Thank you so
was
much.
perfect.
I'm actually going to stop the recording, or maybe just...
I can stop sharing my screen as well, I think.
No, it's... Hold on, stop.
If you need reference
recording.